Hey guys, we're gonna read from chapter 3 of Old Yeller this morning. Sorry about the camera shaking. And you all can watch this when you have time. All right, here we go. All right, I was willing to go make a try for a fat doe. I was generally more than willing to go hunting. And while I was gone, I might do some thinking about little Arliss and that thieving stray dog. But I didn't much think my thinking would take the turn Mama wanted. I went and milked the cows and brought the milk in for Mama to strain. I got my rifle and went out to the lot and caught Jumper. I tied a rope around his neck, half hitched a noose around his nose, and pitched the rest of the rope around his back. This was the rope I'd rein him with. Then I got me a second rope and I tied it around his middle, just back of his withers. The second rope I'd use to tie my deer onto Jumper's back if I got one. Papa had shown me how to tie a deer's feet together and pack it home across my shoulder, and I'd done it. But to carry a deer very far like that was a sweat-popping job that I'd rather leave to Jumper. He was bigger and stronger. I mounted Jumper bareback and rode him along Birdsong Creek and across a rocky hog-back ridge. I thought about how fine it would be if I was riding my own horse instead of my own mule. I had rode down a long, sweeping slope where a scattering of huge, ragged, topped live oaks stood about in grass so tall that it dragged against the underside of Jumper's belly. I rode to within a quarter of a mile of the salt licks, then left Jumper tied in a thicket and went on foot. I couldn't take Jumper close to the licks for a couple of reasons. In the first place, he'd get to swishing his tail and stomping his feet at flies and maybe scare off my game. On top of that, he was gun shy. Fire a gun close to Jumper and he'd fall to staves. He'd snort and wheel to jump and fall back against his tie rope, trying to break loose. He'd bawl and paw the air and take on like he'd been shot. When it came to gunfire, Jumper didn't have any more sense than a red ant in a hot skillet. It was a fine morning for hunting, with the air still and the rising sun shining bright on the tall grass and the greener levels of the timber. There wasn't enough breeze blowing for me to tell the wind direction, so I licked one finger and held it up. Sure enough, the side next to me cooled first. That meant that what little push there was to the air was away from me, toward the salt licks, which wouldn't do at all. No deer would come to the licks if he caught wind of me first. I half circled the licks till I had the breeze moving across them toward me and took cover under a wild grapevine that hung low out of the top of a gnarled oak. I sat down with my back against the trunk of the tree. I sat with my legs crossed and my rifle cradled on my knees. Then I made myself get as still as the tree. Papa had taught me that way back when I was little, the same as he taught me to hunt downwind for my game. He always said, it's not your shape that catches a deer's eyes, it's your moving. If a deer can't smell you and can't see you move, he won't ever know you're there. So I sat there, holding as still as a stump, searching the clearing around the licks. The licks was a scattered outcropping of dark rocks, with black streaks in them. The black streaks held the salt that Papa said had got mixed up with the rocks a jillion years ago. I don't know how he knew what had happened so far back then, but the salt was there, and all the hogs and cattle and wild animals in that part of the country came there to lick it. One time, Papa said, when he and Mama had first settled there, they'd run clean out of salt and had to beat up pieces of the rock and boil them in water. Then they'd use the salty water to season their meat and cornbread. Wild game generally came to lick the rocks in the early mornings or late evenings, and those were the best times to come for me. The killer animals like bear and panther and bobcats knew this, and came to the licks at the same time. Sometimes we'd get a good shot at them. I'd kill 2 bobcats and a wolf there while waiting for the deer, and once Papa shot a big panther right after it had leaped onto a mule colt and broken its neck with one slap of its heavy forepaw. I hoped I'd get a shot at a bear or panther this morning. The only thing that showed up, however, was a little band of javelina hogs, and I knew better than to shoot them. Make a bad shot and wound one so that he went to squealing, and you'd have the whole bunch after you, ready to eat you alive. They were small animals. Their tushes weren't as long as those of the range hogs we had running wild in the woods. They couldn't cut you as deep, but once javelinas got after you, they'd keep after you for a lot longer time. Once Jed Simpson's boy, Rosal, shot into a bunch of javelinas, and they took after him. They treed him up a mesquite and kept him there for early morning till long after supper time. The mesquite was a small one, and they nearly chewed the trunk of it too trying to get to him. After that, Rosal was willing to get the javelinas alone. The javelinas moved away, and I saw some bob-white quail feed in the opening around the licks. Then here came 3 cows with young calves and a roan bull. They stood still and licked at the rocks. I watched them a while, then got to watching a couple of squirrels playing in the top of the tree close to the one I sat under. The squirrels were running and jumping and chattering and flashing their tails in the sunlight. One would run along a tree branch, then take a flying leap to the next branch, and there it would sit, fussing, and wait to see. Let's see. I just lost my place. When the squirrel did, the first one would set up an excited chatter and make a run for a longer leap. Sure enough, after a while, the leader tried to jump a gap that was too wide. He missed his branch, clawed at some leaves, and came tumbling to the ground. The second squirrel went up, dancing up and down on his branch, then chattering louder than ever. It was plain that he was getting a big laugh out of how the show-off squirrel had made such a fool of himself. The sight was so funny that I laughed myself, and that's where I made my mistake. Where the doe had come from and how she ever got so close without me seeing her, I don't know. It was like she'd suddenly lit down out of the air like a buzzard, or risen right up out of the bare ground around the rocks. Anyhow, there she stood, staring straight at me, sniffing and snorting and stomping her 4 feet against the ground. She couldn't have scented me, and I hadn't moved, but I had laughed out loud a little at those squirrels, and that sound had warned her. All right, so we're going to stop there. So it sounds like he's got a deer, but he has made noise, and so she knows that Travis is there. So we will finish chapter 3 tomorrow.